Welcome to Horror Makes Us Happy, the podcast where we ask the question, what is it about horror that makes us happy? Your hosts are Steve Becker and myself, Chris Whitman, and you can find out more about us at our website, horrormakesushappy.com. Before we get started, this is the trigger warning. This is a horror podcast. We will be talking about horror things, so the discussion could involve such sensitive topics as graphic violence, murder, child abuse, the R word, the F word, lots of letter words when we talk about bad stuff. So with that out of the way, Steve, what do we still have coming up in the incredibly long line of awesome guests ever since you went to the StokerCon and corralled them, or cast-netted them, if you will?
We are still at 10 on the list. We briefly dipped down to 9, and then within the last 2 days, we had another one added, so we're still up to 10. So I won't bother going through the list. But
we got a lot. And we're going to get even more soon, because I'm going to a couple of horror conventions in October, so more. Yes.
Potentially that as well. I've also reached out to a few people because there were people that I hadn't reached out to yet because I was thinking, well, I'll wait until our guest list dies down, but it hasn't been dying down. So now I'm going, okay, well, do you want to schedule something for next year? Because if we don't put you on the calendar, we might not get it. This might be a steady thing here moving forward. So we'll see.
Growth is good.
Yeah. I'm not complaining. So what else? Your webcomic at piecesofflesh.com, horror-themed, cannibalistic, necromantic cannibals. My book, A Guide to the Recovery Toolbox, has a coupon code for, you can purchase it for 99 cents at the moment, good till the end of the year, at smashwords.com. The coupon code is LE69E. And rolling into today's guest, Mr. Christopher Hawkins. Welcome.
Thank you.
Our pleasure. Currently, I think best known for your books, Suburban Monsters and $1 Horror. There's actually a series of them called $1 Horror. What are you currently working on?
Well, I'm currently working on the release of my debut novel, which is called Downpour. That's going to be coming out. I'm not sure when you're going to broadcast this, but it's coming out on October 3rd. And beyond that, I have a short story that just dropped in Underland Arcana called The Clockwise People. And working on more books and more short stories on top of that. So
nice.
Keep them busy.
Yeah. Looking at the calendar, this should air in December, so it'll definitely be up by then.
Excellent.
So people can go check it out. Is there any particular, what's the word I'm looking for, platform that gives you a better deal if they go to it? Like,
not so much. I mean, it's available, pretty much anywhere you're going to buy books. So you can get it on Amazon. You can get it on BarnesandNoble.com. You can request it at your local bookstore. Independent bookstores can pick it up as well. So, yeah, anywhere you normally buy books, it'll be there.
Okay, cool. Well, I don't know how much we had discussed at StokerCon because it's been a little while now, but basically the theme of our interview is we break it into 4 sections. The first 3 are talking about what you were a fan of related to horror in your childhood, teen, and adult years, and then the ending section is kind of a wrap-up where we talk about any reoccurring themes that maybe come up in the earlier parts of the call. So starting with childhood, what are some of your earliest memories of scary things?
Oh, wow. Yeah. I grew up in the 80s, so there was a lot of great scary stuff kind of coming out in that time. It was almost kind of a golden age of practical horror effects and, all these great kind of things being done with John Carpenter's The Thing and, everybody kind of pushing the envelope of what could be done with practical horror effects. I remember watching cable TV as a kid and kind of daring myself whenever I come across a horror movie to see how long I could last. So a lot of the early, the early Friday the 13th movies, like parts 1 and 2, John Carpenter's The Thing I just mentioned, those were movies that I would watch in little kind of 10-minute bursts, and then it would get to be too much, and then I would turn it off, and then I'd, of course, still be fascinated, so I'd eventually go back again. So to this day, I don't know that I've... what's that?
Bad word for it.
No, say again.
I said conditioning yourself to horror.
Yeah, it is kind of a little bit. It's seeing how long you can hold your hand over the fire, right?
It's like horror therapy.
A little bit. Yeah, it's definitely sort of daring yourself to keep going. But yeah, so those are some of the early memories that I have about about horror stuff. And then, of course, from the reading standpoint, I cut my teeth on Stephen King. My mom was a big reader, and I would see her reading these books with like these really interesting covers. And I remember The Stand that had like those two characters kind of fighting on the cover. And I'm like, oh yeah, what's this about? She's like, yeah, you can read this. And I'm like, oh, okay, great. I'll start reading this.
You can read this. It's only like 1,500 pages. It's fine.
Right.
It's fine.
Yeah, at like 8 or 9 years old, it's completely appropriate, right? So that was definitely something that I was punching above my weight there, but it stuck with me, and I've been a fan ever since.
Nice. So The Thing, practical effects, Friday the 13th 1 and 2. Do you remember a particular scene in Friday the 13th 1 or 2 that stood out to you?
Oh God, yeah. I think it was part 2. I don't think it was part 3. But there's that scene where the girl is being stalked by Jason, and she's like stuck in this room with Jason's mother's head kind of like arranged with with like her sweater. And again, it's been years and years and years since I've seen the movie, but she like puts on the sweater in order to like talk to Jason and kind of convince Jason that she's actually his mother. And that, to me, I mean, like, God, even as a kid, it's like, wow, this is messed up. That's great.
Right.
So, that sticks with me. And then, like, any given scene from John Carpenter's The Thing, like the whole thing where Wilford Brimley's trying to do the CPR and he gets his arms bitten off. It's just like, oh, God. Like, the first time you see that, there's no way you can be prepared for it. And it's just, it just comes right out of the blue. And it's this moment where you kind of realize that these people that are making this film are madmen, and anything can happen, and you are not safe, and there is no seatbelt. It's fantastic.
Nice. What'd you like about The Stand?
I liked that it was, because as a kid you kind of read these like, I was big into fantasy at the time, so all of the stories were very like, here's good and here is evil, and good will always triumph over evil, and there's a very clean line of demarcation between the two. And that book had all of those elements, but it still worked in the gray areas where you had characters that were ostensibly on the good side, but then they kind of fell away and ended up on the bad side, and vice versa. I love the character of the Trash Can Man. I mean, to this day, I think he's just like this really like just amazing like chaos agent, and I love those kinds of characters in books. I mean, it just it had this like epic feel in a way that I wasn't used to reading in epic stories at the time. So it just felt very fresh to me. So that was something that definitely stuck in my brain.
Okay. Did you participate in Halloween when you were a kid?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Favorite costume?
I don't know that I have a favorite costume. I have a few that I remember pretty distinctly just because of how awful they were.
Well, that would be the next question, is least favorite costume. But.
Yeah, no, I remember one year, and this was very, very early on, because being an 80s kid, of course, like Star Wars was like the thing, right? And when Star Wars came out, which is in the 70s, I was super, super young at that point. I wanted a Star Wars costume, right? Like I wanted like a Darth Vader costume. I wanted a Stormtrooper. I wanted a Skywalker. I wanted all of that. But I don't know if it's because my mom went late to get a costume, but I ended up with C-3PO. and I don't know. I mean, I don't know how old you guys are, but like, back then, like the costumes that you would get were like these solid vinyl sheets,
mm-hmm.
and they were hot because you're essentially wearing like a tarp, basically,
plastic,
right?
Yeah.
And it's like tarp. Plastic. It doesn't breathe. It's just very like rigid. And then the masks were like a rigid plastic, and they didn't care how comfortable they were. It was just like it was digging into your face in like weird spots, and it was just super uncomfortable. And I remember my dad was like big into safety, so if we were out, we weren't like allowed to wear the mask because he was afraid that we were going to get hit by a car because we could only see through like the tiny eye slits, which is a legitimate fear. I mean, to give him credit. So here I am like walking around in this like terrible like vinyl costume that I didn't even want anyway, but was still technically Star Wars.
yeah. I mean, yeah.
Could have been a Jawa.
Could have been Jawa. I was trying to think like what character would be lower than C-3PO. Like even R2-D2 is cooler. But
R2-D2 is cooler. R2-D2 actually helps the plot along. Yeah, I'm trying to think. Like, I can't think of.
Although, really, when you think about it, for the height, a Jawa would have been more fitting.
That would have been fun, like, and this was like right after the first movie came out, so there was no like Ewoks or anything like that, like any of those things going on. But yeah, I think a Jawa would have been fine. At least no one could have seen my face, right?
Let's see. Did you have any scary dreams when you were a kid?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know about so much dreams, but I always had trouble falling asleep because my mind was always kind of going a mile a minute, and so it would take me a good half an hour, 45 minutes to fall asleep on any given night, and that's when you're a little kid. That's like the worst time for like any of those scary thoughts to come out because. You can see everything that's in your room, but it's not the same as it was when the lights were on. Like if there's a chair in the corner and there's something draped over it, you stare at it long enough, it'll start moving, right?
Yep.
That's how it happens. It's such a weird phenomenon too, right? Because I would swear that things were moving, and then I'd be like too afraid to like get up and try for the light, right? Because whatever it is going to come get me. But so there were. I mean, I was kind of a timid kid, so there were a lot of moments like that I remember, kind of like cringing in bed, like deliberately like looking around the room for what's the next thing that's going to come, going to come to life.
I can relate. Been there.
Sure, a lot of people can.
You may have I
just said I'm sure a lot of people can.
Yeah, you may have answered the question I was going to follow up with, which was to say, when you fall asleep, you're talking about your brain always going. How can I phrase this? Do you remember it being a sense of anxious energy, or was it just wired?
No, I mean, I think it was a lot of anxiety when I was a kid. It probably didn't help that I was reading Stephen King books at 8 years old, but
good point.
Yeah, I mean, it's the whole landscape of of what's familiar changes when the lights go off, right? So
yeah. And
I also, my grandmother, who I adore to this day, I don't understand what possessed her, but she made, she was very much into making things, and she made a clown doll for me when I was a kid that I kid you not was the size of me, imagine little Chris with this clown doll that is meant to be cute, but clown dolls are never cute. It was terrifying. And it's literally my size. I mean, you could stand it up next to me, and it could totally take me in a fight, is what I'm getting at. And of course, it had to stay in my room. Like I love my grandmother, but I hated this thing. And of course, it had to stay in my room. So it became like this exercise of, all right, well, what other stuffed animals can I pile on top of it?
Oh, okay.
As like an early warning system, like in my little kid logic mind was like, okay, well, if the clown can come to life, then surely my little stuffed friends can come to life and like help me battle against it, giving like some kind of edge, right?
Yeah, or hold it down.
Yeah, exactly. Like maybe just keep it in place while I kick it in the face or something. Anything, yeah. And so I would pile my my stuffies around it just to kind of like just to kind of like intimidate it. I don't know what I was thinking, but it was it became like this weird kind of exercise.
Didn't look like the one from not Exorcist, Poltergeist, did it?
No. Whoever gave that kid that clown needs to be in jail. That was a terrifying clown. And what I love about that movie is that once all the stuff happens, right, and you get that kind of false ending at the end where it's like, oh, okay, everything's fine, and we're going to move out of the house, and we're going to start a new life.
Yeah, it was all in the house.
Yeah, what's there on that same chair in the same spot looking right at that kid, that damn clown?
Mm-hmm.
No,
right? Like,
wait, when they went to the hotel room?
No, not in the hotel room, but there's like that period where they're like everything happened with Carol Ann, and she's like back, and
it's before the storm, right?
Oh, yeah, that's right. It was in the same house, but they had the incident, and they got everything was returned to normal. But yeah, you're right. They kept the damn clown.
They kept the clown. Like, who would do that, right? Like, after that traumatic situation, that poor kid, like, they just hated that kid, honestly. That's like my headcanon was that they did not like that kid because he, it's like, as soon as things go bad, it's like, yeah, we're going to get rid of you. We're going to send you off to
Right.
grandma or whatever. Like that we were planning on doing that anyway.
Like, oh no, Robbie's being eaten by the tree. Yeah, but Carol Ann's okay, right?
Carol Ann's fine. Yeah, but Robbie, yeah, we're going to take our time. Like, maybe.
She was the cute one. I mean,
Yeah.
Right, yeah. I mean, Robbie had like the weird teeth. It's like, how the poor kid.
that family definitely had favorites.
That's my headcanon is they just really did not like Robbie.
So your mom read King. Was your grandmother also a horror fan, or is this just a one-off?
No, my grandmother had like this collection of Reader's Digest condensed books. And I don't know, for anyone who might not be... Right, yeah. And I think it was the law at the time, right? But yeah, for people who aren't familiar, the condensed books, it would be like one volume that would have like 3 or 4 books in it, but they'd be cut down. And now the idea of doing that, it bothers me greatly. But that was like fairly common at the time, right? So you could, take a 600-page book and whittle it down to 200 pages. So it's like, oh yeah, of course I read that book. I got the major points. It's fine. It's such a weird thing. I don't think they do that anymore. I hope they don't do that anymore. But yeah, so there were a lot of that. So I remember reading Jaws in that like abridged format, and it was pretty nicely illustrated. So they had like these like great little pictures that went with it that I think were like more fascinating than the text at the time. But yeah, so there were a few things that I kind of picked up.
Okay. Did anything happen in real life as a child that terrified you?
I don't know about terrified exactly, but when I was in high school, this was in Griffith, Indiana, there was a kid who was about my same age who was murdered by a serial killer.
Oh. Yeah,
her name was Wendy Gallagher, and she actually went to a different high school from me. Like in Griffith, there was Griffith High School, and then there was Calumet High School. And Calumet High School served like a little bit of Griffith. There was like a small like sliver of Griffith that went to that school, and of course we were terrible rivals. But yeah, she was just like out of the blue. It was like this random thing where her door had been unlocked, the door to her apartment, and this guy just, who had killed in a couple of different states, just sort of happened to be there and killed her in this very like brutal way. And the way it kind of spread through our school, because we didn't know her directly, was all through sort of rumor. And of course it started out and we're like, yeah, this is a BS story. We're not going to like engage with it. But then, people are bringing like these newspaper articles and start to follow it. And it was this, this weird kind of boogeyman episode that was happening in real life. And it was, it was more sad and tragic, I think, at the time than it was terrifying, but it's always kind of stuck with me.
Yeah.
Yeah, something like that would stick with you.
No shit.
Yeah, absolutely.
Has that affected your life in any way in terms of, changed behaviors?
I don't know about changed behaviors. I mean, I am pretty fastidious about making sure the door's unlocked, but, I think I probably would have been.
For a half second, I thought you said unlocked.
No.
Sorry.
No. I always come down on the kids when it's like, they'll come in from school and leave the door like wide open. It's like, come on. Yeah. I won't tell them the Wendy Gallagher story, but
yeah.
I definitely want to.
I was gonna say same thing with BTK.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a terrifying story.
Well, that was his thing too, is he claimed that, oh, you left the door open, you must have wanted me to.
Yeah, and that's a terrible thought, right? Like when you think about these people who have these sort of warped mindsets, that would, to even be able to conceive of, killing someone at all, let alone in like such a brutal fashion. I mean, that takes such a warped mentality. It's hard to, it's hard to connect with. And maybe that's part of why I write horror, is to kind of understand that mentality, at least the limited way that I can. But it's, yeah, it's weird to think that you're probably passing people like that every single day. And you just don't know it. I mean, the statistics are you come across like 5 or 6 murderers in your lifetime, and you just don't know it. That's
a really creepy feeling when you think about it. Like you hear the statistics, but if you think about it, if you're in a large enough group in a public area, there's a very good chance that you're within 20 feet of a serial killer at any given moment.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
I don't know about 20 feet of a serial killer, but maybe 20 feet of a murderer.
Somebody
killed someone.
But here's the thing about serial killers that really bothers me and worries me. The ones that we catch you have to think that there are
There's more that's not being covered.
Yeah, that's like that's the iceberg that you see, but what about the iceberg that you don't see, right? You know, it's you know, how many, because every 5-6 years there's a story like this where, you know, someone dies and they like go into their house and they find like all of these like bones or, you know, or what have you. There was a story very recently, I can't remember, I think it was in Australia, where they, you know, it was this guy who had a farm and you know, suddenly they're finding all these human remains on it, and it was some kind of like social welfare call that was how it started. And you know, they just found out that you've just been doing this for forever, and you have to wonder how many stories are like that out there that we just don't know about. It's chilling to think about.
Yeah, and there are ones out there that, you know, the law enforcement community knows about, but they're not telling people for whatever reason. That's not fun either.
It's another layer of discomfort.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, on one hand, I can kind of understand it, because when you talk about those kinds of things, often you'll get copycats. And so maybe they're trying to avoid that. But at the same time, you know, how do you balance you don't want that, but you do need help maybe catching the guys. So, or warning, if the case may be.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned law enforcement, because in the town that I live in now, there's there's actually a national case. I can't remember. Drew Peterson was his name. He was a cop who was suspected of murdering his first wife, who died kind of mysteriously in the bathtub, but it was sort of covered up and not really talked about because he was on the police force, even though there was, you know, all kinds of, you know, rumblings that there were, you know, domestic violence involved and all this other stuff, but that was kind of covered up. And then his second wife ended up disappearing under mysterious circumstances, and he was a private pilot, and there are people who said that they saw him like loading like a, you know, a strange like orange barrel onto his airplane, or you know, like all of these, you know, things that would lead you to think of foul play. And you know, he was finally sent to jail for that murder, if I'm remembering correctly, and then they exhumed the body of his first wife, and I don't remember how that ended, but whether or not he was found guilty of murder for that first death, I'm not sure, but you know, that was a big case in our town.
Yeah, I recall hearing about that.
Yeah.
Flipping that question around, was there ever a time in your childhood when you felt completely calm or safe or bliss?
Oh, you know, that's a great question, especially for a horror author, because it's really not something that we do. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say. I mean, I moved around a lot as a kid, and my parents divorced when I was kind of young, so, you know, it was not the easiest of childhoods. I mean, certainly, you know, there've been worse, but yeah, I can't really think of a single like moment. I mean, my favorite moments were always kind of revolving around you know, various media, right? So, you know, like being able to disappear into a book or disappear into a movie that I loved, you know, that you know, those to me were always kind of like the good moments.
Okay. The next two questions I'm going to give to you at the same time, just so you kind of get an idea of what's coming. But we'll start with the negative one first, so we can end on the positive. Okay. First one being, do you remember the first person you hurt? And then next one being, do you remember the first person you helped?
Wow, that's a deep question. Yeah, I have to think on that one for a little bit.
Come back to it if you want.
It can be emotionally or physically. Like, for instance, the first person I hurt was a small girl in preschool that I accidentally fell on and broke her collarbone. On accident.
Wow. Yeah. No, I do remember there's a story that my dad loves to tell. I mean, he has like 3 stories about me, and they're all embarrassing.
They usually are.
Right. Yeah. And there was this girl that I used to pal around with as a child, like probably 5 years old. And I came home one time, and she had punched me, like legitimately punched me. And you know, I came home, I was crying, I was upset, and blah blah blah. And you know, of course, my parents are all upset. They're going to go and talk to this girl's parents and all this other stuff. And they're talking to me. It's like, okay, well, you know, why did she hit you? And it's like, well, because I hit her. And they're like, well, why is this a problem? It's like, well, because you hit me back.
Mm-hmm.
So
I love your parents' logic. They're like, well, you're even. We're done.
Right? Yeah. Like, okay, well, maybe we don't make a big deal out of this one, right? Yeah. So, I mean, and it's funny because I don't remember the incident, but I've heard the story so many times that it's like, it's almost like memory by proxy. But yeah, that might be the first one that comes to mind.
First person you helped?
First person I helped. God. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, it's weird that the negative stuff sticks in your brain a lot more than positive stuff, though. Yeah, I can't. I mean, like, nothing really leaps to mind, at least from a young age.
Okay. Not every question's going to land. You just ask because you never know.
Yeah, no, I mean, God, nothing leaps to mind. It makes me sound like a terrible person, but
no. You never know what you're going to remember or not remember.
Sure.
So some of our guests have reported sort of a dividing line where prior to the line they were afraid of horror, and after the line they now found enjoyment in it. Was there a kind of line like that for you when you were a kid, or like where? Or was it always pleasure?
I don't know that there was a line per se. I mean, I think through like my early high school years, I was very easily scared, but I think as I got like more into the craft of filmmaking, at least from a studying standpoint, like I got very into how special effects were made and what the techniques were, like how they built these spaceships and how they did these special effects and how they poured these these rubber in the molds and how they made fake blood and all this stuff and like all Tom Savini stuff. And I think once I started to understand more how those effects were created, it became more of a fascination with the process than it did in actually being scared of what was on film. And to this day, if I watch a horror movie, I'll be watching it more from a standpoint of how did they do that or how did they get this particular shot than I am, sort of invested in the moment and being frightened by it. Maybe I'm jaded now, but I don't really get scared anymore.
It does kind of enhance, but also ruin it. It
does. Yeah, I mean, that's been kind of the process with the consequence, I guess, for lack of a better term, with the writing, is that the more you get into the techniques of storytelling, the more you recognize them.
It's the auteur side of
other things. Yeah, exactly. So then it becomes a different kind of enjoyment when you find something that's really cool. So in terms of like a strict demarcation line, no, I think it was more of a gradual process, but that would have been why.
The reason I asked is because you were saying there was a point where you were daring yourself to see how long you could last. So it sounded like there was some like that there. How can I say that you might have been like straddling the line at that point, like there was both fear and pleasure. So
I was definitely towing up to it. I think there was such like an allure to it, the idea of here's this thing that I'm not supposed to be watching. It's clearly an R-rated film, and I'm clearly way too young for this. And being able to almost dare yourself to experience it, and almost dare yourself to grow up a little faster than you probably should. I think that's part of that that draw.
Yeah. So, teen years, what were some of your favorite scary stories or books or movies in teenage years?
When I was a teenager, I moved back into the fantasy camp. So I was, way into Dungeons and Dragons, and was, reading everything I could get my hands on that, Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman were writing. But one thing that, from a horror standpoint, that really stuck with me during those years was the original Twilight Zone. And that was something that I would watch anytime it was on, flip through channels. I would stop as soon as I saw that black and white. And, I've probably seen every episode 6-7 times. It's, one of those things that's really kind of shaped my enjoyment of horror and, later went on to shape my writing as well.
Favorite episode?
Oh, there's so many. Most of the Burgess Meredith episodes, which I know is kind of a punt because everybody kind of goes to them like Obsolete Man and Time of the Last. There's also this great episode called Dust that it's one of the Old West episodes that they did, and that's one of the things that was great about the show is that they would go to Rod Serling, and the studio would have just finished filming a Western. It's like, okay, well, we don't strike the set for a week, so you can use it if you want. And then Rod Serling would be like, okay, and you would write a Western Twilight Zone in like 2 days, and they filmed it in 3 days, and it was basically like free production value. And so it was this great story about like belief, and it was this old man who like buys this magic dust from a guy who has like a he's like a snake oil salesman, and he spends like all of his like what amounts to his life savings for this magic dust that's going to help him save his son from being hanged. And it's this great story about just belief, and that one's really stuck with me. And then there's this episode with Art Carney called Night of the Meek. It's a Christmas episode, and Art Carney plays this kind of washed up like department store Santa Claus, and it's just such an emotional and beautiful and weird story, and I cry every single time I watch it, and I try to watch it every year around Christmas time, and it's just fantastic.
What's so emotional and beautiful about it?
It's just him kind of, again, like that idea of belief, where here's a guy who's kind of seen the worst side of humanity, and he gets this chance to sort of believe in kindness again, and that's that's something that's just really, really powerful.
I'm thinking I may have seen that one.
If you haven't, like as soon as we're done recording, like go watch it. It's amazing.
You mentioned two names, Margot something and Tracy Hickman.
Oh, Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman, yeah. They did the Dragonlance books. I don't know if you're familiar with those, but
I recognize the name.
Anyone who was into D&D in the 80s like read their stuff, and it's funny because you go back and you read them now, and it's like, wow, this is horribly derivative. And it's it's still fun, it's still great, but it's like, yeah, okay, I can see they're kind of wearing their influences on their sleeves, right? And a lot
as you did in the 80s. It was
exactly. Yeah, and a lot of the Dungeons and Dragons stuff, like when TSR was sort of at its height, the guys who created Dungeons and Dragons, they were not just the creators of D&D, but they were the largest single publisher of fantasy fiction, I think, in the world, certainly in the United States. So everything that they were putting out sort of had that Dungeons and Dragons sensibility to it, right? Where it's like, okay, here's this sort of team of misfits, and they're going to go and they're going to save the world. And there's going to be a dragon involved, and there's going to be like weird monsters, and it's going to have magic that is very similar to the magic that you have in D&D, and it's going to be familiar, and it's going to be popcorn, and it's just going to, it's going to almost be this kind of disposable fiction. And, so much of that stuff was like wrapped up in, being influenced by Tolkien, and being influenced by like early Michael Moorcock books, and influenced by, Bob Howard stuff. But it was all kind of through that tabletop gaming lens. So, it all kind of, after a while, kind of all felt like, it was all one piece. It all kind of felt the same.
Yeah. Can only kill so many mobs before they just start to look like, blobs of, hit points.
Yeah, exactly. Like how many orcs are going to show up to this fight? Yeah, exactly.
Participate in Halloween as a teen?
Less so, I think. I always loved the idea of trick-or-treating, and partly because it was this sort of communal thing, and partly because you got to glimpse like other people's homes, in a way that you normally didn't. It's, you're standing on the front door, but you're standing in the dark, and their homes are lit up, and I think there's something like really kind of emotionally powerful about that idea of being on the outside looking in. There's like this voyeuristic quality, even if there's nothing sinister behind it. There's this sense of
adventure in a way.
Seeing a context of somebody else's life that you aren't necessarily always privy to. And I remember once when I was a kid, trick-or-treating at a teacher's house, and seeing the teacher show up at the door, and it's like, wait a minute, don't you live at the school? Like, what?
Right.
Like, what are you doing? yeah, how do you have a separate life? It just blew my little kid mind, right? Yeah, so that was fascinating, and I think that because of that, I trick or treated a little bit longer than was probably socially acceptable at the time. So, but that was good because that kept me from getting into trouble, doing any other kind of like older kid prank stuff, or any of that, TPing houses and egging cars and all that stuff.
Well, for the question about having something actually terrifying in the teens, this is where I'd written down the part about the classmate being killed by a serial killer. So we can jump straight to the inverse of that, which is to ask, was there a time in your teens when you felt completely calm or safe or bliss?
Yeah, I mean, I think high school was really kind of the time when I found my people. And I think that's true of a lot of people in high school where, you're stuck in grade school and you're stuck in middle school or junior high, as they called it. You're kind of stuck amongst these people that you don't really choose, right? You're in these classes, and some of these people are only in those classes because they happen to be around that elementary school that was geographically closest to them, right? But when you get into high school, it's a little bit wider group of people. You start, having the same people in the same classes. You have more commonality with them. So yeah, I kind of found my people then, and it was, it was nice to kind of know that. One, there were people that had the same kind of like weird fascinations with fiction and with horror that I did, and didn't see that as a bad thing. So that was that was kind of nice.
Did you guys have any like social events related to horror movies, or going out to theaters with friends or sleepovers or that kind of thing?
More in college, like we had a group that would go out, and we were very kind of film focused. So I remember we would, we would go out and see, whatever was coming out at the time, and it wasn't always horror, but there was usually something that was either like sci-fi adjacent or like whatever the big blockbusters were at the time. But it was always kind of the same group, so it was this kind of bonding experience for us.
Okay, moving into adult years, and I know this might be a little more difficult because there might be a longer of a stretch, but if we talk about things that impacted you in your adult life for horror media, whether it's books or movies or whatever, can you think of like what are the first things that come to mind?
Yeah, that's also kind of a tough question. The things that I tend to gravitate towards as an adult are, by and large, are the same things that I kind of gravitated towards as a kid and as a teen, So, like the Alien movies, those are, very dear to my heart. I keep talking about John Carpenter's and things because that was such a, just like a what the fuck moment when you're watching that movie and you're like, okay, all the rules have been thrown out the window, anything can happen. So those are the things that have kind of stuck with me, and I've been trying to sort of pass them along to my own kids. And sometimes you'll get this reaction from them saying, "Oh, okay, that rubber puppet that you're like completely obsessed with, like that's the thing, that's the whole point of this movie." Okay, sure, yeah, no problem. That's great. And they're very indulgent about it, but you can tell that they're like, yeah, this doesn't really hold up, and I don't understand why you love this, but I'm glad that you do.
They don't think it's aged well because they weren't brought up with that stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Although conversely, when you find something that hits, like that first Alien movie that kind of blew their minds in the same way that blew my mind. And,
still classic.
Yeah, it's so great to see when something does hold up and see that reaction for the first time. My kids are both teenagers, so we're able to watch pretty much anything, and just seeing them have these kind of like jaw-dropping moments is really gratifying.
Nice. Any other movies where you've had that reaction with them?
Yeah, like we just watched, and it's not a horror movie, but we just watched a Christopher Nolan film called The Prestige, which honestly, it plays with a lot of horror elements. And, I don't, for anyone who hasn't seen it, I don't want to give it away because it's one of those movies that you can really...
Yeah, there is that one big twist.
Yeah, you can really only experience that story once, right? And you can experience it multiple times and get different things out of it. But once that big reveal happens, the prestige that they talk about in the magic trick parlance, it's this moment where you're just kind of left with your whole world kind of rocked, and it's like, wow, I can't believe this actually happened. And that's when the horror, like the horror elements of that film really fall into place, and you're kind of left at the end of this movie thinking, oh, how did you really do that? That's how does one do that and not go insane? And it's this amazing, build up to that moment. So that was kind of fun to watch them experience that for the first time.
Yeah. I didn't know that was a Nolan film.
Oh yeah, it's one of his early ones. He did. I think it came right after Memento came out, and it was before the whole Dark Knight trilogy.
Halloween as an adult.
Halloween as an adult is both kind of simultaneously more fun and less fun because we never really decorated for Halloween. It wasn't really a thing, I think, when I was growing up. Like, people would put like a skeleton, like a little paper skeleton in the door or something like that. But in terms of like big yard displays and these like giant Home Depot, like 9-foot skeletons that you can get, I mean, like that just didn't exist back then. So I think it's a little bit more fun from that standpoint to be able to make your house a haunted house for a little while and sort of live in that space for a little while. And I've always been a big fan of the whole like Disney Haunted Mansion aesthetic, so that's kind of what we try for when we're decorating our house, is to kind of have that kind of like, okay, well, this is spooky, but it's okay, it's still kind of kid friendly, and, it's spooky but not not too scary kind of feel. So it's kind of fun to play in that space. And now my kids are grown, but those first few Halloweens with each of the boys when they were very, very small were just magic. I mean, I remember taking my oldest, he was dressed in a little pirate costume, and taking him around from house to house and just having his little mind just blown that you could knock on somebody's door and they would give you candy, right? And then like having him just having this yeah, exactly. Like, I had no idea this technology existed. Like, why are we not doing this every day? And then the very next day, when he put on his Halloween costume on November 1st, saying, okay, let's go do this.
Let's go do it again. Yeah.
Right. And then having to explain, like, no, I'm sorry, we can't do that now. It's only one day. And then, just seeing that, like, that weird kind of shift, like it's like, okay, we give him like this great moment and then the great disappointment like immediately following. It's
so be reminded of it's a small video of a raccoon that discovers cotton candy.
Yeah,
watch it.
I am aware. Yeah,
like, yes, this is so great. Oh wait, no.
And you can see a very human disappointment on that raccoon's face. Yeah,
you really can. So that's kind of a smaller version of the thing with the kids, and yeah, it's interesting thinking of that. Like, plus what you said about how houses are much more over the top these days with the decorations and everything. Like, oh sure, it's gotta be insane as a small child going up to this house that's just like covered in decorations and skeletons and lights everywhere. Like, it's a whole event.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially when the kids are small, you kind of have to convince them, like, no, okay, that skeleton's not real, it's fine.
Right.
So there's an element, at least,
and then you get the houses where somebody's dressed up and actually does move and scares the shit out of them.
Yeah, and we would look for those houses and we would try to avoid them. And like I remember there was a place that I'm kind of sad that it's gone now, but they called themselves the Dead End Haunt, and it was an event where they were at the end of the cul-de-sac and they would decorate for Halloween, and they had like animatronics and soundtracks and all of these things that they had kind of built up over the years, and it was very professional looking. It was just this amazing kind of thing. And one year they brought in like community theater actors to to play like like zombies, and there was this one person who was playing a little girl who was like it was very vague, but it was like this undead like little girl who was looking for her dolly and stuff like that. And we didn't know that they were going to be actors, but we took the kids anyway. We were kind of walking around, and they would not break character, even though we're like, hey, look, we've got little kids. Can you just back off with just a smidge? Like, just like, I get that you're trying to scare people. Why don't you go scare those people? That'd be fine.
So for things actually terrifying in real life as an adult, I had the thing with Drew Peterson. Anything else you want to add to that list, or is that good?
Yeah, I mean, I think as an adult, you find a whole different class of things to be terrified by, and they have nothing to do with supernatural or anything like that. I mean, the first time driving home with my oldest son, maybe one of the most terrifying things I've ever done. Just the idea that here's this tiny person who is completely squishy, like even though they're in this like almost like a tank of a baby seat, it's probably safer than any restraint that I have. Just the idea that if we got into a wreck, this kid would be at risk. And did the people at the hospital know that we're completely unqualified parents? That mix is pretty terrifying. But yeah, I mean, the world is a scary enough place. There's a lot of real world fears, and that might be part of why I retreat into fiction a lot, because at least those are contours that you can easily understand, and once you put the book down, they're gone.
Right. Flipping that question around, any time in your adult life when you were completely calm or safe or bliss?
Yeah, I mean, I think those times are probably, I'm trying to think of the right way to phrase this. I mean, I think that they're certainly more frequent than they were when I was a teenager. I think the older I get, the more calm I tend to be about just the day-to-day stuff. And when you grow up, I mean, I've lived with anxiety my entire life, so it's it's easier to find those moments where you felt unsafe than when you feel safe. But I think part of just growing older and realizing, okay, well, you made it this far, you're probably going to make it the next 20, 30 years too. It'll be fine. Having that experience behind you is calming all by itself.
But at the same time, not, because then the other side is on the way, and the inevitable march of time.
Well, we try not to think about that too much.
Something in between.
Yeah,
exactly.
I mean, the girl with the ankh around her neck is going to come for us, one way or another. But it's
I'd be okay with that.
Hopefully not for a good long while.
If it's Neil Gaiman death, I'm okay with that.
Yeah, I think most of us would be, honestly.
Just a visit, not a permanent visit.
Yeah, exactly. But that's the only time you're ever going to see her. So.
Shoot, there was something I was going to add. Last person you heard.
Oh God, do we have to answer this question?
No, you don't have. Actually,
don't.
Yeah, no. I mean, I think what bothers me, I think generally, is when you you've hurt someone and you are able to recognize that, or they're able to tell you, at least you can make amends for it. What really sticks with me is the idea that you could be hurting people and never know about it, and never have that chance to give context to what you might have done or not done, to be able to apologize for something. Those are the things that kind of create these worry points in my life. So yeah, I mean, I can't think of the last time that I've caused someone pain, but I'm certain that I have in a lot of cases without knowing, and that's a little troublesome.
Do you remember the last person you helped?
Oh, last person I helped. Yeah, I mean, these are really hard questions for me. I don't. Yeah, I mean, and maybe I'm just a terrible, selfish person, but no, I can't think of. I mean, there's, I'm involved in the Chicago chapter of the Horror Writers Association, which, StokerCon is wearing that. And, I try to, as the co-chair of that group, I try to be helpful. I like to be, encouraging of other writers, and, try to help other writers, especially in that group where I can. So I guess being a part of that group might qualify, but
no, it definitely qualifies. Yeah, you're an inspiration to your fellow writers and your readers.
Yeah,
I'd like to try to be at least. Yeah,
nothing wrong with that. Like I said, you never know what the answers are going to be to some of these questions, and that's why we ask it, because you.
Oh, sure, yeah, no, I feel bad because I don't have an answer, and then it makes me think, well, maybe I didn't help someone, and it's just selfish and weird. I don't know.
No. Like you say, I mean, for example, this thing about you're actually not the only person who's brought up the HWA. We have had at least one other guest who mentioned that.
Yeah, it's a good organization. It's I think every professional contact that I've made has started in some way through the HWA.
Nice. So the next two questions I'm going to ask are going to be over your entire life, and it's not just about horror. This could be any genre. But I'll give you the two questions at the same time, because it could be the same answer for both or two different answers. First one being, what movie have you watched more times than any other? And then second one being your favorite movie.
They might actually be the same thing. Empire Strikes Back.
Oh, okay. Really? Okay.
Yeah. When I was a kid, I'm old enough to have seen it in the theater, and was just kind of blown away by it. And at the time, so this would have been like 81, I think. Okay. My dad had a friend. This was when VHS was just sort of becoming a thing, at least in our area. And the idea of being able to record a movie or record a show and watch it at home whenever you wanted was this incredibly novel idea.
Oh, yeah.
And also kind of fascinating. But if you were going to buy a movie at that time, a movie was $100. And this was $100 in 80s money, right? So incredibly, incredibly expensive. But my father had a friend who had bootlegged those first two, and at that point, the only two, Star Wars movies. So I would watch Empire Strikes Back, I kid you not, like twice a day.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I mean, I was obsessed. And to this day, I think I had that movie memorized. And so like for an entire summer, I would watch that movie over and over and over again. And it was just endlessly fascinating to me. And even when I watch it now, like the way it's edited, and the propulsive storytelling, and the great character interactions, and it has this amazing script. And people tend to kind of downplay the performances in Star Wars movies, and they have a point when it comes to that first one, but in the second movie, I mean, the character dynamics are already in place, and people are like playing off of each other in these really interesting ways. The introduction to Billy D. Williams' character and all of this stuff, and then that like weird kind of downer ending where I had never seen that in a movie before. It's like, well, you mean the good guys don't win? That kind of blew my mind too. So I think to this day, that's just still one of my favorite movies of all time.
If you could describe your emotional reaction to it, what would it be?
Just awe. I mean, there are so many moments in that movie that blew my mind as a kid. And I remember I was spoiled on the ending when, the whole Darth Vader being Luke's father thing. Sorry if anyone hasn't watched it.
I think it's been out for long enough.
Spoiler alert on the 40-year-old film. Yeah. But I mean, the whole thing about, Darth Vader and Luke at the end, I remember being told that by one of my friends at school who had seen the movie, and I hadn't gotten to see it yet. And I'm like, he's like, oh yeah, Darth Vader cuts off Luke's hand, and also he's Luke's father. I'm like, you're full of shit. That does not happen.
We joke about mentioning it 40 years from now, but this was like 40 days from when it came out. Come on, kid.
Yeah.
Spoilers.
Yeah. I mean, and the thing is, like, it might as well have not been a spoiler because it was just as shocking when it happened. You just didn't believe him. You're like, nah. Right. Nah, I don't believe you. Like, no, that doesn't happen in movies. I'm sorry. You're making that up. And then I had to go back to it and be like, oh my God, you were telling the truth. That's amazing. And it was so far from the norm of what I was used, the kinds of stories that I was used to seeing. The idea that the good guys could get their asses handed to them, and that was just the end of the movie. Like, yeah, sometimes you lose, and it's a great lesson to learn as a kid too. But it blew my mind. It was great.
Yeah, I'd say it's not uncommon for Empire to be the favorite among most people. It's just got that nostalgia feel. Plus, from the original trilogy, it was the best.
Yeah, and it is objectively the best Star Wars movie, and I will fight anyone who says otherwise. Yeah,
fight me.
Not
right? Yeah, like
objectively.
Yeah, like my kids grew up on the prequels, and it's not their fault, but my son will sometimes just like get my goat and be like, what the best Star Wars movie is? Episode 3, and I'm like, you know what, you can just get out.
Go stay with your mother.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, let's see after a few days on the streets if you think that's the best Star Wars.
How'd you get your kid? They said Star Wars wasn't good.
Exactly. Pass that piece of cardboard.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, God, that's getting a little darker than I intended, but no.
Horror podcast. We've done the disclaimer.
I was just going to say.
Right. Exactly. So, hi everybody. Read my books.
Going back to horror for a moment, do you see any common threads about what kind of horror you like? Occult, metaphysical, cannibal, supernatural?
Yeah, I mean, I like to think that all of it is good as long as it's done well. I like being surprised, and it's when a movie kind of hits that sweet spot where you've got excellent performances and excellent character interaction along with a really good premise that seems fresh and interesting. When you can kind of hit that that sweet spot where you have all of those things firing, those are the movies I really gravitate to. So It Follows is one of those movies that I feel like kind of hits that spot where it's like, wow, this is not necessarily a complicated story, but it manages to tell it like very, very effectively, and everything in it just kind of works. And Get Out is the same way, where it's got this like really dark and sinister premise to it, and the performances are amazing, and it's just this one of those movies that's like almost like a perfect piece of cinema. The first two Alien movies are very much like that for me too, especially that first one, because that just in the same way that The Thing, you kind of feel like you're in the hands of like people who are a little unhinged and anything can happen. It sort of has that same kind of feel to it. So yeah, those are the movies that really appeal to me. So
quality storytelling.
Yeah, the quality of storytelling, but also with that mix of surprise as well. So if you can scare me and break my heart a little bit at the same time, that's like my sweet spot right there.
Okay. So this would be the part where I kind of outline some of the things, potential common topics that have been coming up, and then we talk about that a little bit. And you can either tell me I'm right or wrong, or if I'm slightly off, tweak, what I'm saying, or add to it if I'm completely missing something. But sort of the twin, there's like two things. One being magic or belief or hope or awe. I think those kind of all are in the same bucket or puddle, if you will. Touches on D&D, Night of the Meek, Dust, Empire Strikes Back, touches on all of those. And then having this, the twist or with the chaos, the surprise, you're not in Kansas anymore. And the outside looking in voyeurism, I think that might also relate to more the magic or the belief stuff, but also possibly the twists. Because I mean, depending on what happens and what you're checking out, do you think those are the two, key things for you in your love of horror? Or do you think there's something else, or am I like slightly off?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's certainly part of it. The idea that you're kind of privy to or witness to something that, is a little bit hidden, a little bit transgressive. I mean, like there's in that first Texas Chainsaw Massacre movie, there's it's a great movie in a lot of ways. It's also a terrible movie in a lot of ways. But there's there's this idea that when they first come to the house, that they're trespassing and seeing inside of something that was not meant for their eyes, right? There's something very powerful in that, right? That you're sort of crossing this threshold that you were never meant to cross, right? So I think that is a very important aspect of horror for me. But there's also the idea of being a party to that transgression, right? So like if you're reading a horror novel, or if you're watching a horror movie, you're in it with the main characters, right? So if they screw up, it's the same as if you're screwing up, right? Like if they're a bunch of horny teenagers at a camp that are being killed by a serial killer, that's you're in that too, right? Like, and it morality aside, you're still you're in that same boat with them, right? That's something that's really powerful to me, is that ability to kind of, I'm probably not explaining it very well, but it's the ability to sort of lose yourself and make the character's situation your own. That's something that is really compelling to me.
Yeah, that's why I always look at the story viewing and reading as well. Is like if you're able to lose yourself and like become one with the protagonist and get in the driver's seat of the story, then that to me is the accomplishment of a well-told story.
Yeah, and that's really half the battle when you're writing horror as well, is to kind of create situations that allow you to identify with a character and really if somebody's being chased through the woods by an axe murderer, nobody cares, right? I mean, it's still, unless you know that character and you're afraid for that character, you're not going to feel that same sense of anticipation and terror that the character is feeling.
I hear what you're saying, but for me, I think the identification, it's like, it is important because it's like the path on how you get to what's really important. If you don't have a path to get there, obviously everything fails. So it is important, but it's not as important as the other stuff, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. I mean, for me, like, character is always very foundational. I know there are a lot of writers out there that kind of are situational writers and that doesn't make them any better or less. It's just different. But for me, having that point of identification and having that emotional connection to somebody, that's really like the key, I think.
It is, but then the question is, what emotion are you triggering? And that's where we're talking about. And I'm glad that you brought up the thing about crossing the threshold, because that was one that I didn't bring up. But so transgressing, things that aren't meant for your eyes, and now looking at that compared with the magic, belief and hope, and wondering if they're equally of interest to you, or if the transgressive part is more interesting to you than the hopeful part. Makes sense?
Yeah, I mean, they're really kind of two sides of the same coin for me. If you find yourself in a situation where you're being hounded by a killer, you're being threatened by a supernatural force, that hope is the only thing that's going to carry you through. The idea that something like that can be overcome, even in the face of all the evidence contrary, that's really where, horror stories, I think, are made. It's this idea that, yes, this terrible thing is happening, but I can get away if I'm clever enough. I can get through it if I'm smart enough, or if I'm righteous enough, or whatever is framing that story. So without that hope, you're really not going to have the same terror. You're going to have somebody who's just resigned to death, and there's no fun in that, right?
I don't know, because I mean, if you think about that, you could also say, keeping things in the I statements, I could say, no, I would still be terrified if I found out that there was no hope. It would just be a different kind of terror.
Yeah.
And the reason that I'm asking this is because, for example, with Empire Strikes Back, when you say at the end, the good guys didn't win at the end of that one,
Mhm.
I mean, it sounds like in your case you are leaning towards the hope, but I wanted to ask because I could see it going either way with you at this point in the conversation. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, and I think I follow you. Yeah, I mean, when I'm telling a story, I always want it to be an out, and maybe it's an out that the characters don't get to experience, but I always want there to be a feeling that something, some good will come out of this, right? If not good, at least catharsis, some change. And Empire Strikes Back is actually a really good example of that, because there's this scene at the end, which I've only learned recently was not originally meant to be in the script, and I can't imagine this movie without that scene. But at the very end, Luke gets the mechanical hand, and they're like all, he's like there with Princess Leia, and Lando and Chewie are like going off to like save Han, and there's like this moment where all these characters are not necessarily standing together, but they're all sort of united in purpose, and they're looking out like almost literally towards the horizon, because they're looking out at like this vast expanse of the galaxy, right? And it's this amazing hopeful moment, that says, okay, well, even though we just literally got our asses handed to us, I mean, we are like in really bad shape right now, good things are possible. Mm-hmm. And had that movie ended, right, exactly, had that movie ended any other way, I don't think it would have been as powerful. Like if it just ended with Luke on the ship with like the mask over his head and like cradling his stump and all that, that would have not been anywhere near as powerful. But you have that very human sort of need to press on even in the face of overwhelming odds, and that to me is important to have.
Is there something that, if you look back on your life, is there something that triggers a desire for something like that?
I mean, I think just human beings in general always want to believe that whatever bad happens has a purpose, right? I think there's a reason that the idea that, well, this is just God's will, right? Like every bad thing is in service, and I'm not a religious person, but I know many people are, and the idea that any bad thing has a purpose and that it's all part of a greater plan that will result in something good. That's such a common idea in humanity, just in general, that I think there's a lot of weight to that.
Hmm. Having narrowed in on that, then one of the last questions here: why horror? Because couldn't you explore that in other genres?
Yeah, I mean, you absolutely could, and many writers do. I think with horror, it's just one of those things that I've always gravitated towards, and they're the stories that I have in my head. So it's much more of a me thing, I guess, than anything else. Yeah, I mean, I think if I was a different storyteller, I could probably still tell those kinds of stories that have that uplifting component at the end, or at least the potential for an uplifting component at the end. But these are the stories that I've got. They're the ones that that come to mind. So, I mean, I guess the answer to why horror is just because this is who I am.
Which is a fair answer.
It's a good answer.
Yeah,
it's a good answer.
Right.
Yeah. Last question: is there anything you've thought of that might be relevant that hasn't come up on the call? Or maybe you thought of something and then the conversation took a left turn?
No, I mean, you guys are asking like really, really deep questions, and I appreciate that. This has been a very very thoughtful experience. I appreciate that.
That is what we are trying to do.
Yep.
Awesome.
Well, thank you very much for your time. I'm going to hit
Well,
close.
thank you.
Yeah. And thank you to anybody out there listening. You can come visit us at horrormakesushappy.com, support us on Patreon, buy us coffee, join us on Discord where we do listen parties, or just tell a friend.